Social Studies 20. Going to take a look at the course of World War I today. Not going to spend a whole lot of time on specific battles. We look more at the conditions under which the war was fought, and apply that to the course. It'll work better that way. So there's going to be a Western Front and an Eastern Front. Show you some maps in a few minutes. As you know, World War I goes from 1914 through 1918. Um, the best way to describe World War I would be trench warfare. And so this is the kind of warfare that is very static. There's very little mobility. What happens is each side digs into their set of trenches and they basically stay there for 4 years. There's some movement and there's some mobility, but not like we would think of war when we think of World War II and wars of that nature. And so by that we're talking about a stalemate. There would have been what is known as a stalemate on the Western Front. Very little movement either way. In some cases they're fighting for maybe just a dozen or so meters of territory, and they're lucky to get that. Stalemate on the Western Front. Conditions were deplorable. The trenches were your home, your refuge, your zone of safety if you were a soldier. So imagine the rain, the mud, the snow, the vermin that would have lived in those trenches. It's actually hard to fathom and hard to even describe. I guess you really would have had to been there. Best way of saying it might be a veritable hell on earth. We'll watch videos later that show life in the trenches. I'll show, although I'm sure you've heard of that before. Conditions were awful. Tactics you're going to find were very antiquated. By that, I mean technology since the last set of wars, the Napoleonic Wars, and that's something we should spend some time talking about. The last major conflict for Western Europe would have been the Napoleonic Wars of the early 1800s, and that was 100 years before World War I. Technology has moved a long way in 100 years, the weapons, etc., but not the tactics. So what you're going to find, weapons had been mechanized and modernized by a lot, but the tactics had virtually remained much the same as they were during the Napoleonic Wars. That's going to be a deadly combination. You should also make a note, too, this will soon be a war of what we call conscription, or if you want to call it a draft, I guess it's kind of the same. So after the initial breakout of the war, there was a big rush to enlist. There was more than enough volunteers. They're turning some people away, but they're going to need those people later on. So what I'm trying to say is they very quickly run out of people volunteering to fight this war because of the conditions of the war, and so they have to force them to go fight. We call that conscription. Spend some time talking about the myths of war. War up until this point was very romanticized, and by that I mean a lot of young men dreamed of fighting a major conflict for their country. For a lot of young men, it gave them upward mobility. It was a chance to move up in terms of your socioeconomic status. If you came back a war hero, you elevated your family name. As well, it was your duty to fight wars. Those that didn't go fight voluntarily were very often labeled cowards and might even have to move away to earn a living and make their livelihood. So this was very much a war of duty, of patriotism, of you fighting for your country. You probably didn't know why you were fighting. You probably didn't even really know much about the countries you were fighting against, but you knew that you had to do it. Otherwise, face accusations of cowardice, etc. Believe it or not, a lot of men joined because they thought it was a good chance to see the world. They thought it was an adventurous thing to do, see places they otherwise were not going to. And the common saying was, if this was August, September of 1914, you'll be home by Christmas. That was said and heard a lot in the fall of 1914 when the war began. You'll be home by Christmas. Both sides were saying, you'll be home by Christmas. If they were lucky enough and lived, they'll be there 4 years later still thinking they might be home by Christmas, but probably not. Here's a map of Europe on the eve of World War I. And so the countries in blue signify the Triple Entente. So as you know, Britain, France, and Russia were the Triple Entente. Canada, because we were tied to Great Britain, we're part of the British Commonwealth, we fought alongside the British um, as part of the Triple Entente. And then the other side, of course, was the Triple Alliance, and we're talking about Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. We'll spend most of our time talking about the Western Front, but understand that there is also an Eastern Front too, um, between Germany, Russia, and Austria-Hungary and Russia as well. Very quickly, both sides will build their networks of trenches, and there's actually just way too many to put on one map. This is just one region of Western Europe, and so all these lines signify the trench warfare. The big dark ones are major trenches, and the smaller dotted lines are smaller subsidiary network trenches. Hundreds of trenches. In many ways, a shovel in this war was almost as important as a rifle. It was a war fought in the dirt, fought in the trenches. Typical enlistment posters back home in Canada. Your chums are fighting. Why aren't you fighting? So very much a bit of a guilt trip. Why are you not here dying with your comrades? It would have been hard not to fight for your country in World War I. You would have stood out. People would have scoffed at you, maybe outwardly accused you of cowardice. More enlistment pictures really, drumming home that duty. Don't forget that Canada at this time was fighting under the Union Jack flag. We won't get our flag until the 1960s. More enlistment for pieces of propaganda. Propaganda is a one-sided message. It's what all countries would have used and do use in times of war and conflict. You're trying to invoke feelings of nationalism, maybe even ultranationalism. So propaganda is a one-sided message. These are examples of propaganda. And just to understand that if I gave you enough propaganda over time, I will indoctrinate you. I will get you to think what I want you to think. A simpler way of phrasing it might be brainwashing, but better to call it indoctrination. Spend more time on that in chapters to come. Here's the technology, the fighting technology from the Napoleonic Wars of the early 1800s. These were modernized weapons for their time in the early 1800s, but not by the early 1900s. So the typical Napoleonic War rifle can fire 2 rounds a minute because it does not have an automatic reloading cartridge. And so you can see this guy in the middle is reloading his rifle. You've probably seen that on TV shows. If you think about the movie The Patriot, that is kind of the technology they're using. So the rifles could fire two, maybe 3 rounds a minute if you were really good. And over here we've got artillery used during the Napoleonic Wars, the field cannon with a range of 900 meters, and they can fire 1 round a minute. So they were very deadly for their time, but by the time we move to World War I, they're really antiquated. Typical Napoleonic battlefield scene. Take a look at the guys marching forward in a straight line. That's just how they fought. That was considered the gentleman's way of fighting and dying at its time. It's not effective. You're a sitting duck, but that's how they did it. And so just imagine if you brought this battlefield tactic, strategy to World War I, how that would be a very deadly combination considering the modernization of weapons. Speaking of which, here are some photos of those modernized weapons that I've been talking about. So first of all, over here is a World War I machine gun that can fire between 400 and 600 rounds per minute. You compare that to the Napoleonic rifle of 2 rounds a minute, and this one's much more deadly. So just imagine men charging a trench with 1 or more of these machine guns and how that would be a veritable waste of human life. Trenches down below here, barbed wire up top. Barbed wire, I think, had been patented in around 1874. It was a very effective way of keeping the enemy at bay. Before they could charge you in your trench, they had negotiated the barbed wire, And as soon as you were tangled up in it again, you became a sitting duck. And down here, the poisonous gas, chlorine gas, mustard gas, very deadly and used for the first time in World War One. Ironically enough, the soldiers' refuge, the trench, would often be where the gas would settle. So you pick your poison. You stay down below and inhale the gas and probably die, or you climb out of the trench and expose yourself to sniper and machine gun attacks from the enemies. The poor guys. World War One artillery, there were all different kinds. This is the Big Bertha. It had a range of 6 miles. Hard to fathom a weapon that could fire upwards of 6 miles with fairly good accuracy and a huge detonation upon impact. So the clash of this new technology and the antiquated war tactics was just a deadly combination. Millions of young men died without even firing a shot. They had no chance. They didn't know what they were signing up for. Typical life in the trench. Imagine the mud, the cold, the fear. World War One was devastating to Western Europe. That used to be a lush forest, and now it's turned into a quagmire of death, rotting bacteria, etc. Even today, here's an aerial photo of a field in Belgium showing you the after effects of trench warfare uh, and as well the artillery shells that you can see scattered about the countryside. Typical diagram of trench warfare. And so here you've got one side charging the enemy, so they've got to get across what is going to be called no man's land, which was the territory between one side's trench and the other side's trench, no man's land. So you've got to negotiate that, the craters, many of them filled with water. You've got to negotiate the barbed wire, and then you've got to contend with the enemy's trench. And as I said, these were networks of trenches that went for thousands of miles. They do develop air support as the war goes on, and you can see their artillery in the background here. More photos of World War One. There's a dreadnought in the bottom right-hand corner. They developed the tank in the middle years of the war as a means of negotiating the trenches, the barbed wire, and of course the enemy machine gun fire. The tank was actually developed to give the soldiers something to hide behind as they moved forward and charged the trenches. More trench diagrams. I picked this one because it shows you no man's land. No man's land could be several miles in width. It could be maybe just a couple of dozen meters in width sometimes. More scenes of the trench. Here's what is known as a firing step or a parapet that you can step up on to see over top. This was war that devolved into what is known as total war, and by that I mean up until this point, most wars that were fought, unless you were a soldier fighting them, you may not even know when your country was fighting a war. It didn't really affect you back on what was known as the home front. This war was different. This war drew upon almost all of society. And so even though women in this case weren't fighting, they were expected to do their part at back home and work in the factories while the men were out fighting the war. Very strict rationing. Everything went toward the war effort, meaning that even if you weren't fighting overseas in Europe, you suffered from shortages back home as well to get those men the supplies to fight the war. In 1915, Italy actually switched sides and joined the Triple Entente and abandoned the alliance. The Russians will actually leave the Triple Entente in 1917 after the Russian Revolution. Lenin overthrows the Tsar and the monarchy, and his first order of business is to pull Russia out of World War I. It was going horribly for them. They signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which basically allows them to leave the war and stop fighting with Germany, but they give a lot of farmland to the Germans to have to do that. But Russia is now officially out of World War I as of 1917. And then the Americans get involved in April of 1917. They had not been fighting in the war up until this point. The two reasons for American involvement: number one, the sinking of the passenger ship, the Lusitania. The Lusitania was sunken by a German submarine because the Germans had committed themselves to sinking all of America's naval vessels coming from America to Britain. Even though America wasn't fighting the war, they were bringing munitions and supplies to the Triple Entente so they could fight the war. The Germans knew of this. They warned the Americans to stop. And eventually, a German submarine torpedoed the Lusitania, sunk it, and killed over 1,100 Americans, which outraged them. And then it forced Congress to act. Another reason for the American entrance, and this one's kind of ludicrous, uh, Germany had approached Mexico and said that if Mexico agreed to invade America from the south and they were able to defeat America, um, Germany would give Mexico back territory that America had taken in the mid to late 1800s, places like California, Texas, and so on. So those two events together is why America joined the war, and it brought with it a huge influx of manpower and more weapons and supplies to the Allied war effort. Austria-Hungary surrendered and left the war in 1917. So if you think about this now, of the original Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, Italy switched sides. Austria-Hungary has now surrendered. Really, all you've got left from the Triple Alliance is Germany. And they held out for a while, but they couldn't forever. And 1 year later, in 1918, you got the official German surrender. Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated the throne, which meant that he gave up the throne and fled, and World War I officially came to an end. The armistice was agreed to November 11th, 1918, which, by the way, is Remembrance Day. So that is the course of World War I. Tragic, horrible conflict. Millions died. I wouldn't say needlessly, but in many ways I guess that it was, and that as we'll learn next, not a whole lot was really gained from World War One. And the way they settled World War One is going to be one of the direct causes of World War Two that was even more deadly. But it's a really good example of nationalism, of patriotism, and I think a really good example too of ultra nationalism. You know, as soon as you're killing in the name of your country, as soon as you're dying for your country, we're now talking about ultra nationalism, and that is the theme of related issue number 2. Stay tuned. In the next presentation, I'm going to talk about the consequences of World War I and how we officially ended World War I. Thanks for listening.